Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
Welcome everyone to our second broadcast live from Dubai here at COP28. Welcome, and we are looking forward to the discussion from PwC's Experience Centre. My name is Jessica Fries and I am the Exec Chair of Accounting for Sustainability, established by His Majesty the King nearly 20 years ago to transform finance and accounting and make sustainable business as usual. I'm really pleased to be joined here in the stage by an excellent set of panellists, and also online we have Hubert joining us. So before we get started, each day at COP has a different thematic focus. So today we're really going to be deep diving into finance and some of the key developments we're seeing from the finance part of the discussion. And really, although yesterday was Finance Day here at COP, we are also seeing a huge amount of discussion on finance throughout the week so far, and I think we will continue to see that into next week. So over the next 45 minutes, we'll be exploring some of the headlines, where we've seen the progress, and what more is needed. Before I turn to the panel, it would be great just to share some of the headlines from His Majesty the King's speech, which opened up the Climate Action Day earlier this week. I shared some of the quotes from the speech, but we have a short clip from the BBC, which we will now play for everyone, just in case you missed his inspiring words.
Lest we rapidly repair and restore nature's unique economy based on harmony and balance, which is our ultimate sustainer, our own economy and survivability will be imperiled. Records are now being broken so often that we are perhaps becoming immune to what they are really telling us. When we see the news that this last Northern Hemisphere summer, for instance, was the warmest global average temperature on record, we need to pause to process what this actually means. We are taking the natural world outside balanced norms and limits and into dangerous, uncharted territory. We are carrying out a vast, frightening experiment of changing every ecological condition all at once, at a pace that far outstrips nature's ability to cope. We are all connected, not only as human beings, but with all living things and all that sustains life. As part of this grand and sacred system, harmony with nature must be maintained. The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth.
So you do a lot of work in this area as well. So Hubert, you're CEO and Chairman of Africa Investment Group, also a member of A4S's Advisory Council. And I know that you've been really focused on how to scale up and mobilize private finance, both into Africa, but also more broadly thinking about how to really scale up finance into a developing and emerging economy. So can you say a little bit more about both that question of some of the developments you've seen in the discussion around the role that multilateral development banks can play, but also more broadly where you see the key steps forward in terms of mobilising private finance?
No, thank you very much, Jessica. And I think I agree with all of my colleagues where, it's probably appropriate to just say we talked about finance on Finance Day. It's absolutely been a theme throughout, from the Loss and Damage Fund to the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund to this Altera $30 billion platform. But here's where I sort of come in on this. We are talking, I personally believe that the whole agenda has been mischaracterized as a finance agenda to just interests of the development finance institutions, current and legacy business models. Because when you begin to look at the trillions that are required and the sort of the multi-decade approach that we have, this is really a long-term investment. And whilst I welcome all different sort of multilateral development bank, I don't know, increased demonstrations of intent in the future to mobilize private capital at scale. The reality is they don't have the balance sheets to be able to mobilize trillions that we need, and they don't have the internal systems or the culture to be able to do it at the speed that we need. So I think everything and everyone sort of got on the bandwagon saying, yes, everything must be catalyzed through the MDBs, but we're in a private capital mobilization market failure. MDBs are supposed to mobilize $10 for every $1 of finance that they provide. And their ratio, according to the G20, is they mobilize 20 cents to 38 cents for every dollar. I remember being in Glasgow talking about 8 or so years for Africa to mobilize $3 trillion for our nationally determined projects. I'm here now talking about much less than that to mobilize even more. So I think that going through the MDBs and making them the principal de-risker and mobilizer for these trillions is a lost opportunity. I think we need to create a whole new reality and a very different model. If you want to mobilize public capital at scale, it's probably not best to come to the private sector and ask for advice about how to do that. Conversely, if you want to mobilize private capital at scale, I believe if you can actually work with the institutional investment community, the 150 to the 200 trillion pool of assets who are universal owners, long-term investors, I think you're going to get a very different and more strategic outcome. But the problem is that we have our heads of state, and I served on President Macron's new financial pact, private sector and finance task force preparing for the new financial pact summit. And there just doesn't seem to be a realism about how to do things at scale. We sort of default back to the old models, and they're just not going to work. And if you look at the fundamental things that we need, just like data, the multilateral development banks hold the global emerging markets database, which is critical. I mean, it has all of the performance of their loans over the last 20 years. As the institutional investment community, we've been asking for this for over 10 years. They've refused to give us this database so that we can actually increase our exposure and properly price our exposure to emerging markets and developing countries. And that consequently costs emerging markets and developing country governments $15.6 billion each year in excess interest on their loans, and it's not happening. So I'm not a great believer that and the reality is, Jessica and viewers, even if all of the reforms happen, even if the private sector lab works, it will never be able to mobilize more than 10% of the financing gap. So, what we really need to say amongst ourselves, the Avivas, the Africa investors, the global institutional market, came together as a group and we issued a statement as institutional investment community at the beginning of this COP. It was ourselves, it was Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, it was Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change, ILN, SMI, calling for what we're describing as an institutional investor partnership with heads of state. Because we believe that we need to be able to re-architect the entire system so that it can actually be conducive for private capital mobilization, because we don't believe a public sector mindset with a slightly different philosophy that's got us into this private capital mobilization market failure is capable of getting us out of it at speed. So let me stop there, Jessica. Those are just some of the views. And for pipeline piece, it's just another example. The project pipelines in emerging markets and developing countries are typically funded by technical assistance from multilateral development banks that design projects for development finance, not for long-term equity and institutional capital. That's where we have a fundamental mismatch of strategy, approach, and alignment with investment policy statements. And I think until we get there, we're just going to have maybe development capital at scale and not private capital mobilization at speed and scale. Let me stop there.
Yeah, so let me pose that question then to everyone back here in the studio. So Hero, can I come to you first? So how much do you agree with some of the points that Hubert was saying there, and where do you think that the private sector could be doing more to really mobilize and close that gap that Hubert was talking about?
I really cannot agree more. that I always, think
Hubert,
like,
if I can come to you for the same question. So what are you looking for from the rest of COP and then into next year?
I think I 27 asking for some realism on really integrating the investor community into the COP process at the UNFCCC level, but I really want to see COP 28 really take that leadership. I think we're getting there, but we're still finance. I want us to be investment as well. I want us to be really investment focused. I want the incentives and a new partnership between what we're calling climate investment statesmanship, a new partnership between the 150 to the 200 trillion pool of long-term institutional assets, and they come together in an institutional investor public partnership. I mean, in Africa now, super natural capital abundance, 60% of the world's renewable energy, assets, if you like, 40% of the key critical minerals that will drive the key green technologies going forward, and all of our advantages. We want to start hearing the climate agenda described as an incentive, as an investment opportunity, and then really being able to align capital. So we're describing it on the African continent as, how do we, as Hero was saying, and as Mark was saying, and Isabel was saying, that, how do we describe it as an asset class? So we're talking about it in terms of how can you get either developing country or African green industrial infrastructure as a globally competitive, investable asset class. So our phrase for this, and what we really want to see as it relates to private capital mobilization at scale, not the whole agenda, but if you're looking to mobilize private capital at scale, we feel that the market should stop trying to make investment developmental. We actually believe that development should be made investable. And that way we appeal to the whole of the market on the private capital mobilization agenda. So that's really what we're looking for. Private capital mobilization, appeal to how to make it work.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.